Hi, boys and girls, it's Mrs. Blanchett. Today we're going to read Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down out of the icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house. Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice. And every time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheeks. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones laid silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave really rich stews or hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warm dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or nearly enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And the cold weather went on and on. He became ravaging and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he had now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place that Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling the snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that the 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket trudged through the snow on his way to school. Would have to pass Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory, and every day as he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep swallowing breaths as though he was trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blankets one icy morning, "that child has got to get more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But the growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" mumbled Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother trying to slip her own piece of bread in his plate on breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tight over the cheeks that you could see the shape of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seemed to have come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so he could save his strength. In the mornings, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without having to run. He sat quietly in class during recess, resting himself, while the others rushed outside and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, walking back home with an icy wind in his face, and inevitably feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eyes were suddenly caught by a piece of paper that was laying in the gutter in the snow. The paper was a greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw that at once and knew what it was. It was a dollar bill. Quickly, he looked around him. Had someone dropped it? No, that was impossible, because of the way it was buried. Several people hurried past him on the side of the sidewalk, their chins snuck deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching on the snow. None of them were searching for any money. None of them were taking the slightest notice of a small boy crouching in the gutter. Then, was it this dollar? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole dollar. He held it tight between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing for him at that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store, the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quietly to himself, he would buy one luxurious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bite of it, right then and there. And the rest of the money, he would take it straight back home and give to his mother. There we go. That's chapter 10.